We're here today with John Noble up in Downpatrick in County Down, Northern Ireland. John, you have to tell me, is there any truth to the rumour that St. Patrick is buried in the hills here in Downpatrick?
Oh, he definitely is buried here in Downpatrick, yes. His resting place is up beside the cathedral.
So it is true?
It is true. Armagh may try to claim him, but he's definitely buried here.
So there you go. There's an exclusive. St. Patrick is buried here in County Down. John, when it comes to Irish wrestling history, the 4 shows I would have done up in Northern Ireland were through yourself, and a lot of people don't realise there's a rich history of wrestling here in Northern Ireland. And you yourself, you were the first modern day wrestling promoter up here in Northern Ireland. You started back around 1996, was it?
Yeah, about 1995, 96, I started doing some shows. We normally had just a few companies coming over from England over to put on shows. Initially I partnered with them to do a few shows, and then I thought, okay, I'll maybe do a few shows on my own. And that's basically then where it came from.
And tell me, so when the shows that were here, I know from back Northern Ireland, I think back to the 20s and 30s, there was a lot of English promoters who would come over and do shows here. And eventually, I might be wrong now, I think around the 30s and 40s is when you started having Northern Irish professional wrestlers.
Yes, you would have had, some local wrestlers who became quite successful across in the mainland, and then obviously started doing some shows themselves here for their home crowd. And then sort of as you got into the 60s, I'm sure everybody knows, and we don't go on about too much about the Troubles came along. So it probably would have been just, one of those, wrestlers actually doing some shows in partnership with a company over in England, but doing it on their own home turf.
And that's what's interesting. So when it comes to wrestling in Ireland, because realistically, Ireland as a whole was under British rule up until we had our, we won't go to a history lesson of Ireland, but it was in British rule until the 1920s. So up until then, it wasn't out of the norm to not go into one area and stay out with the other. It was just seen as the one nation. And when shows came to Ireland, the earliest I can trace professional wrestling in Ireland was the 1890s. But again, you had wrestlers from England. Back then, it was more of an amateur sport. Catch as catch can, Greco-Roman. So pro wrestling as we know it wasn't the way it is today back in 1890. So for you as a child, did you go to any of the live shows?
Not when I was a child, actually. I probably got my interest in wrestling probably when I was an adult, because I used to do a lot of promotional work, PR work. I did some work with bands, musicians. I was then also writing for local newspapers. I also wrote from a magazine called The Buzz, an entertainment magazine. So I would have been doing a lot of entertainment, and obviously at that time, wrestling was defined as entertaining. So when shows came locally, might have been asked to go along and do a review of it or write about it in advance. So that's where I sort of got the interest. And then probably early 90s, I was asked to do some work with WCW. They were doing a show in Belfast, and I was asked to do some interviews around that. I interviewed Sting, and then that developed an interest then in sort of, this is actually quite interesting, good entertainment. Obviously the sporting aspect of it was good as well, but that's where the interest then came, and then I kept on that interest right through then to start my own shows.
I remember the tour in 1991 would have had the likes of Sting on it and a lot of big names. WCW hadn't got the same popularity as the WWF at the time in Ireland, but still wrestling had more of a history of wrestling, so wrestling shows would be better supported at that time up here in Northern Ireland, wouldn't they? Yeah,
you would have had back then, obviously, because even up till about 1988 we had British wrestling on the ITV channel, which was still quite popular. Obviously it was starting to fade, obviously one of the reasons why it was axed from TV, but they still put on a lot of shows, so a lot of those TV names would have come over here. So off the top of my head, I remember shows over here where you had like Rollerball Rocco, Danny Boy Collins, Greg Valentine, all would have been popular on TV, and they all would have been doing the shows potentially over here for those sort of English-based promoters who came over.
As well, what's interesting is that the World of Sport actually had wrestlers from Northern Ireland on World of Sport.
That's right. Obviously, on World of Sport, you had the most famous one. Obviously, Finlay came from Carrickfergus, so you had him on the ITV. Obviously, then went to America. So those would have been the type of the names that would have been used to sell the shows over here. And although I said I didn't go to any of those shows as a child, I remember hearing about those shows, and they were always in packed venues.
So what people might not understand, because obviously the whole point of these interviews is to let people know of the rich history of not only Irish Whip wrestling, but what came before Irish Whip. And obviously in Northern Ireland and in the south there were shows, but particularly Northern Ireland was the shows. But you had the likes of Wild Angus. I don't know, have you ever heard of Wild Angus?
I haven't. No, I can't say I have. No.
Now he was a Northern Ireland man, and he was quite successful. There was I suppose before Finlay, you had the likes of Wild Angus, and then you had Sean Regan. Again, they're from up here in Northern Ireland. And they wrestled in America, over in Japan, which was before the likes of Finlay did or anybody else, from Northern Ireland. And there is a difference with Northern Ireland wrestlers and wrestlers from the south, because obviously we're two different, even though it's the same country. Technically you have your UK up here, and it wasn't as relaxed as it is now. So people from certain communities were able to train easier in amateur wrestling clubs, say.
Yes.
Whereas now that's all changed, and we'll get into that in a while. But from what I've been told, the two main trainers back then would have been Wild Angus. I think he settled in Scotland by the end. He wrestled briefly in the WWF, and also Dave Finlay the first, obviously.
Yes.
Finlay family are obviously quite famous up here in amateur wrestling circles and professional wrestling circles. So when you were growing up, it was more of a sport than it was as a spectacle.
Yes, it would have been very much, obviously coming from the amateur scene. It would have been the sort of like boxing here in Northern Ireland would be quite popular initially from the amateur, and then people moved to the professional. So yeah, there would have been very rich amateur clubs, probably in different areas across the country, and that would have then developed the stars to obviously go on to do some of the shows who would then turn professional, like Fit Finlay, who then went on and became a big name across the water. And you would have got that sort of exposure, but starting from that amateur.
And then when you look at the World of Sport days and Irish wrestlers, you had Kevin Keneally from Liverpool, but he was second generation Irish parents. And you also had the great Joint Haystacks.
Yes.
But again, people used to think they were Irish, but they were second generation Irish.
That's right.
And Mick McManus, I think his family come from Northern Ireland as well, his parents.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's like probably when you go anywhere in the world, everybody wants to claim they have ancestors from Ireland. We have obviously that sort of catch. And I think, sometimes if you also think back to the demographics of back in that period, a lot of people from Ireland would have went over to work in England, so they would have had that, this is an attachment to back home, and then a lot of them would have settled over there, and obviously had families, so you would still have that second generation Irishness in them.
And what I thought was interesting was, obviously to get into professional wrestling back then, you needed a good background in amateur wrestling.
Yeah.
And there was some guys I spoke to, I suppose a scouting talent back then, and some of the clubs here in Ireland would send some of their students over, and they would try out for the pro leagues, but wouldn't realise they're actually trying out for the pro leagues. And they get into these, to them they thought it was an amateur wrestling match, but it'd be like a fight and shoot holes, submission holes would put on them, without them realising it's a tryout. And yeah, I always thought that was quite interesting, whereas now schools are complete opposite. You get into it with the hopes of being a pro wrestler. But back in the 90s, as far as I know, there's been no wrestling training schools really in Ireland, professional wrestling. since around the early 80s, hasn't it?
Yeah, I would probably say into the 80s, into the early 90s, you probably would have had around Carrickfergus, where the Finlay and his family would have been coming from. You would have probably found there was still a connection there. But gradually they started to decline, and to be honest, I'm not aware of any of those amateur wrestling schools still running in Northern Ireland at the moment.
I know down in Southern Republic now, amateur wrestling is quite popular, and it's making a comeback. Probably the most well-known club would be the Hercules Club, but these days you don't need any amateur wrestling background to be a professional wrestler. But I think it's very important to have an athletic background to get into professional wrestling. And unfortunately, pro wrestling attracts the non-athletic caliber people sometimes. Not exclusively, but you really do need your athletic training, I think, to be in any sport. Pro wrestling for that is no different. So when you see WWE and they're signing people who have a boxing background, basketball, jiu-jitsu, I think that's great, because you have a certain mindset, a structured mindset, a discipline, and then you can train in professional wrestling as opposed to the opposite way around. And that's what it was like with amateur wrestlers back in the day. 50s, 60s, 70s, before that they were athletes, amateur athletes, but at professional level. And that's what made them such great professional wrestlers.
Yeah, it's sort of like when I sort of started promoting some shows here in Northern Ireland, it was quite interesting because you had a combination of people who were training all the time, pure athletes, and then you also had other people who obviously had been in the business for a while, probably I would say not doing a lot of training, but obviously they had maybe perhaps an amateur background, but been in the business for so long, but they could still sell a show, and it was around that time it was really about selling a show, so you had to obviously have very good wrestlers on the show, because if you had a show that the wrestlers weren't so good, then you're not going to get people coming back to see the show. They want to see a show, and it probably back then there was quite a lot about the skill, the skill of wrestling, so you would have had all the holds, all the right moves, then you would have had a little bit of showmanship put into it. But back then when I got involved, it was still very much about the technical aspect of wrestling before the showmanship kicked in big time.
Now it's more showmanship than there is sport and background, so hence sports entertainment. But just to go back, so I know that there was exclusively English promoters, British promoters doing shows. I know we had Dan O'Malley from County Cork when he returned to Ireland from his very successful stint in America, which is a story in itself. Along with Irish business partners, he promoted wrestling shows around Ireland that would draw anywhere from 10 to 20,000 people, whether that was in Cork and Dublin. So there wasn't much Irish wrestling promoters as such. So after Dan O'Malley stopped doing shows, and I remember they said it was disastrous. We read his book, the crowds dropped down to around 3,500 people, which is great by today's standards, but back then it was weak. So a lot more British promoters would run in the South, and they'd run theatres, or they might run some big outdoor exhibitions. Whereas in Northern Ireland, because it was such, like I said, it was completely different place, people who had settled here from England then started to promote wrestling shows that were Irish based promotions, and that's when things started to change up north. But then you had Orig Williams, who was a Welshman, and he started to come into Ireland promoting from, I think it was the late 60s, early 70s, and by around the mid 80s he was exclusively the only promoter running in Ireland at all, whether Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland. So when you started to promote your shows around 95, 96, had you got any dealings, or obviously you had to have some kind of interactions with Orig?
Yeah, I when I first sort of got involved in promoting some shows, it was probably around doing the public relations aspect of the show. So Orig would have been one of the promoters I would have linked with. So I would have bought in the show from him, and then I would have done the whole PR, public relations aspect of it. So yeah, that would have been my first dip into actually promoting the shows. And in fact, I remember probably one of my first shows actually I did here in my hometown of Downpatrick, where Orig put the show on, but I did the marketing and publicity around it, and obviously that's how then I built it from there. Gradually working with him initially, but then after a while thinking, I could maybe do this all myself, and I gradually then moved to actually probably in some way being a competitor, and decided to actually hire the ring, get in the wrestlers, and do the shows myself.
Well, I know if you use as a promoter, I know when I started to run Irish Whip Wrestling originally, I'm sure I upset Orig, and Orig had a partner called Peter Nulty, two very successful promoters, very successful men in not only the Irish, British, but the European wrestling scene. So I find it hard to believe that Orig would have just accepted.
No, shows. Probably obviously when I sort of stepped into the, excuse the expression, the arena myself to do my own shows, yeah, it obviously didn't go down very well. Obviously I was more local here, I come from here, I live here, so it was easier for me to do things, so that was my context, I can do this myself. So that, yeah, it was a bit difficult. There was, probably the phone calls with the threats and, you shouldn't be doing this and I'll put you out of business. I vaguely remember something about, a phone call about, well, if you're running shows, there might be a bomb scare or something like that in it, So I remember a little bit of difficulty when you started out. And obviously, like anything, when you're doing something, it does add to the stress and strain from it. But I think at that stage, I was quite confident and quite capable that I could do it. So obviously, I just motored ahead and got on with it.
But I'm trying to say from what would be Orig's point of view. So he has this territory all to himself for a decade at the time, roughly, probably longer. And somebody comes in, and not only do they not want to buy the shows off him anymore, they want to run the towns he's ran and keep all the money.
Yeah, it's like anything, and when you get into any type of business, obviously competition doesn't go down very well. I personally, from my perspective, I thought there was a market for both shows to be done at different times of the year or whatever. But obviously, probably he was quite precious. He didn't want anybody sharing that market.
So when you were talking about sharing, you mean in the same town? So
yeah, because Northern Ireland is obviously we're quite a small area. We don't have big catchment areas, so really, you need to focus on areas, like obviously Downpatrick's my hometown, so obviously I would always want to do something there. But for example, in Belfast, that's a big catchment area. So if you want to put on a show in there and somebody else wants to put on a show, is there room for two at times? Probably not. And then if you go out of Belfast, because obviously Belfast is the bigger catchment area, but when you go to areas like Downpatrick, Ballynahinch is nearby, Derry, etc., those are small areas and there probably isn't a catchment. So if you're putting on a show and trying to attract 1,000 people to it, and then somebody else is doing something in a couple of weeks' time, there might not be the demand there for another show. So it did get at times quite competitive, but in the early days most of my shows did very, very well. Was very happy, and when I started doing them for myself, I was able to control it, and I could book people, I could go and contact people and book other wrestlers to be on the shows.
So when you say your shows are going very well in the beginning, what kind of numbers are you talking attendance?
Well, in the early days, you're probably talking about 400 or 500 people, like for example, the capacity in the leisure centre in here in Downpatrick, maximum was about 600. So if you took out the ring, it'd give you about capacity of 400. And any time I did a show there, I always filled that local leisure centre with about 400. So it was about 400 or 500 people in my early days, which was quite good.
Just to explain to people, Ireland obviously is quite a small island. Northern Ireland is even smaller than the Republic of Ireland, and back then you're probably talking a spread of population of roughly 1 million, maybe.
Yeah, about 1.2 million was sort of your population back then.
Spread out across the
Spread
land.
out across. So, for example, probably the easiest in terms of numbers, Downpatrick here, where I've lived for most of my life and live now, it's got a population of about 16,000. So if you're putting a show on here, to get 400 is pretty good, because you have to remember not everybody's interested in wrestling.
Exactly.
So getting 400 or 500 is quite honest, a sellout. It's quite a good show. And if you put on a good show, which we did in those days, you will. If you put another show on, you'll get the repeat crowd coming back.
And also for just to explain to people that there's only 6 major cities. Would you even call them a city?
Well, we only really have several. You've got Lisbon's a city, Armagh's a city, Derry's a city, and Belfast is a city. So you've really only got those in terms of city status that I'm aware of. Everything else really is a town or a small village.
And it's very impressive. We have big numbers in those smaller towns.
Yeah.
Really
you have to
is.
do a lot of good sort of marketing and know exactly what you're doing and how to promote it.
So would you have been getting similar numbers to Orig or better?
I would probably have said they were probably similar. They were probably around the same. I would say any of the shows that I even partnered with them, we would pull similar numbers. So yes, in those days you would, if they ran a show, they would have got similar numbers to what I was doing, But gradually then, as I got more confident and, more knowledge of the business, then I started to move up into sort of bigger venues and trying to go for bigger numbers, which eventually I started doing. I would probably say the biggest show that I did over a 10-year probably period was the likes of Maysfield Leisure Centre, where I think I got about 1,500.
That's very, very
which
impressive.
was quite good back then.
And
Lisburn, I think.
Where is the place, the 1,500? That's in Down?
In 1,500 was the Maysfield Leisure Centre. It doesn't exist anymore. It's been turned into offices. But it was a leisure centre in Belfast, and I think it was about 1,500 we got in there. Bangor, which wasn't far away from Belfast, I think we got about 800 there. We used their leisure centre. These are big leisure centres. So we started, to go to bigger. So we started off small venues and then
So you started off small, roughly around 95, 96.
Yeah.
And by the time your numbers go up, what year?
We were probably talking about 2001, 2002, when we're sort of up into those sort of numbers, and trying to do bigger venues to accommodate that. Obviously, if we felt we weren't going to get the numbers, we would have stayed with the smaller venues. But
So tell me, obviously back then, because I know myself starting out, there was no professional wrestling rings in Ireland.
no, I first, obviously, as I said, I partnership with Orig Williams for the first few, so obviously we used his ring, and then after that I would have actually hired one in from Scott Conway from England for the later tours that I was doing. So we would have hired them in, and with that we would have hired some of the stars from Scott Conway, some of the wrestlers that was on his books. We would have hired that as part of a package.
So just to explain to some people watching, Scott Conway was promoted in England. So you had Brian Dixon, you had Scott Conway, Orig Williams. Orig was the only real promoter doing shows here, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was the only one that would have come to Northern Ireland. The rest always focused on the mainland.
So when you had your disagreement with Orig, you then went to Scott Conway.
Yes, I would have then went to, obviously, because wanted to do shows on my own, needed to get a ring, so it's obviously important to have a show. So I then made contact with Scott Conway, and eventually we agreed that he would hire a ring, and he would have brought the ring over, and then I would have done like a week-long tour, because obviously hiring it for a week.
So with your week-long tour, where was that all across Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I would have went all across Northern Ireland, as I mentioned earlier. Bangor, Lisburn, Downpatrick. Always did one in my hometown of Downpatrick if I was doing them. Derry, various other venues, whichever we could get that fits in with the week of the tour.
And tell me, how would Derry draw?
When I first did a couple of shows in Derry, we did very, very well. I think the first one was probably like anything, you're building up your sort of reputation. But once we sort of got in the door and built it up, then yeah, we did pretty well.
Derry is obviously right over the far side of Northern Ireland, opposite to Belfast. And for people who do entertainment shows, Derry always does well, just like Belfast does.
Yeah.
So it's probably it's the two major cities. Derry
Yeah,
and
we
Belfast.
always did the shows in Derry in the actual. The name of the theatre just actually goes out of my head, but there's the theatre in Derry, and
Forum Theatre. The Forum is.
I think it might be. I can't. It's just I've got a blind spot now with it. But we did it in the theatre. It was the only. Well, apart from later shows where I did in other venues, it actually your ring had to be put on the stage.
Yeah.
Which was quite different, you know, for the wrestlers to do the show, because normally you have the full use of the ring and you can play to the audience all around you. When you do a show on a stage, you're literally playing to the crowd out all in front of you. So that was quite unique. And I remember a couple of times when we were recording the shows, you know, the cameraman stood in one place. There was nowhere else to look, you know. So, but yeah, no, that Derry always we always got a good reception up in Derry. It's much more difficult the advanced prep work for a show up there, because from here it's 2 hours drive. So when you're going up to do in those days you did your posters. There was no Instagram and TikTok and all of that. Facebook, you know. So you all had to do all the posters on the walls, and then you maybe had to go up a week later and make sure they were all still up, because that obviously happened sometimes. They were taken down.
And what's quite interesting as well back then with your paper adverts.
Yeah.
Whereas these days, an Instagram post or a Facebook post could get more viewers.
That's right. Yeah.
Than an ad in the paper for £500-600 at the time.
Yeah, I remember actually part of your big budget for a show back then was your marketing and publicity. That obviously was something I was doing, so I sort of had good experience and skills. But you know, things like putting posters up and things like that was all new to me. And as you say, you put your advert in your local newspaper and you just expect people to turn up. It was also back in those days that local newspapers were still quite popular and relevant. Everybody bought the local newspaper, so if you advertised in it, you were near enough guaranteed to pull a good crowd. And we also used to do some promotions with the newspapers, giving tickets away as a prize, which got you an extra week of publicity.
So, for your larger shows, and you have a budget, what would you spend on advertising? A tour and a half?
Probably back then, I would say off the top of my head, was about 25% of your budget was spent, because you know you had lovely, colourful posters, which again had to be paid for. And back in those days, posters were quite expensive, and then your newspaper adverts were also quite expensive, because as I say, there was no other advertising facility, so you had to focus on an expensive newspaper ad. I know when I did some of my bigger shows later on, I would have then looked at advertising in the likes of the national papers we have here, and when I mean national, I mean Northern Ireland nationalised. So you had like the Belfast Telegraph, the Irish News and the Newsletter, and they were megabucks to advertise in those. You could have been talking about £1,000 just for a small ad. And you know, everything had to be carefully managed to make sure you got your return on that £1,000 advert.
And tell me, so with Orig, when you initially started to buy some shows off Orig, do you think that you learned about wrestling from the brief amount of time you had with them?
I certainly did, yes, because like anything, when you do something for the first time, you know, you don't know what you're doing. So obviously if you've got somebody who's there, who's experienced, and obviously Orig had a wealth of talent. So yes, I watched and observed, and I take a lot of things in when I'm doing things. So I took a lot of that wealth of that knowledge and experience in, and then I tried to use that going forward. You know, I very much focused on, first of all, putting a show together, plotting it out. Then I would have looked obviously at the marketing and etc. But the actual, you know, I probably was a bit green at the start, you know, pairing people up, you know, in matches. But I always, probably from the very beginning, I always used to say, okay, I'm going to pair you up, but I want you to basically do the match. It's not for me, you know, that's for you to, you know, to do your your match together. So I'd have paired people up, and sometimes I got it wrong, but other times I got it quite right, and those matches went down really well with the audience. And also, one of the things I learned in the early part of it, obviously watching some of the shows, is making sure you have the right show the right match to end the show, because that's going to keep people buzzing and they're going to go away talking about it. And so probably I was green in the early days, but I did watch, I then also would have went to a lot of other shows. Like if I was traveling, I was traveling in America a couple of times, and I went to a couple of shows and, local little shows, and thought, this is a learning curve for me here. So just learn and absorbed it. But yeah, probably I would have got a lot from, obviously my early days of working with other promoters.
I find, now the reason I bring up Orig Williams so much is that obviously he was the main promoter in Ireland, Northern, South and Northern. You initially started out with him. My opposition when I started out was Orig. Now Orig was a hugely successful European promoter. He's from Wales. He has a book out. You should find it on Google. A lot of the British wrestlers who were successful, the likes of William Regal, Robbie Brookside, they'll all have a lot of positive things to say about him. But when you're in competition with a proper old school wrestling promoter, it's not easy. Sure, it's not.
No, it's not. And obviously, yes, as you said about those wrestlers have a lot of good things to say about them, and probably that is true. But probably if you're a wrestler working for him, it's probably going to be a different context to what it would be if you're a rival promoter with them. Whether or not we would have the same stories of having good experiences with them. But you're quite right. He was very successful in what he did. He had. I also remember he had a very successful after ITV dropped wrestling on the ITV network. He had actually the Welsh channel, C4. He had a very successful program there. It ran for years and years and years. He also did a lot of European promotions. So, very successful. But, I was probably the new kid on the block. Like at some point, you were the new kid on the block, and that doesn't go down well. And it's just it was supposed to be friendly competition.
So there you go. You were taking his territory, part of his territory in Northern Ireland, which you can understand. He's had exclusive rights to it, money coming out of his pocket. But then you're a businessman coming along, wanting to make money for yourself. So that's where wrestling is. It's a very unique business. It's people don't look at it the way they do with normal business. These days you'll see 3-4 takeaways on the same street, 2-3 garage repair shops. Wrestling wasn't like that. It only could be one, and that it was quite toxic at times.
You're quite right. I came from it from obviously not having any background up until then. Most of my work would have been, I would have at the time doing a lot of public relations work. I did a lot of work in the music. I did have a newspaper column. I also wrote for a magazine, as I said earlier. So that's my background. So I was looking at it from, I would love to do the PR from this. I'd love to do the promotion for this. So that was my initial interest. And then I thought, there's probably a few pounds could be made here. So I moved into it as a business perspective. And once I got into it, I actually enjoyed it. I really enjoyed being in it, and there was a good buzz. But the one thing that always struck me when I started it, there was never 2 days the same. So you were organising something, you had maybe had a headache, or say you got a phone call that was somebody was threatening you because you were setting up in competition with, but you just took it in your stride. So not every day was the same, and there was never a dull moment. And I think that probably is why I liked it, is because I like that. I just don't like a boring day-to-day routine. I like to be able to have a challenge, and it became a challenge.
Wrestling would have many challenges. You could get there'd be no ring, or there's no audience, or the paper didn't do the ad the week before. It's
like the one thing that one story that jumps out at me is that we were doing a week-long tour, and it was probably one of our biggest ones. And the van that was transporting the ring broke down, and thankfully it broke down coming back from one of the shows late in the evening, but we had to get it transported to the garage, and then it was touch and go whether or not we were actually going to get it fixed in a garage before we had to travel to the next show the next day. So it was touch and go, and there was lots of frantic phone calls trying to find, well, okay, we'll have to have a backup van, etc., etc. So that was a bit, let's just say, stressful to try and get, because without the ring, you weren't going to have a show.
So we won't say who the promoter was you were working with at the time, but something that's very interesting about that story is the insurance aspect of it.
Yeah.
And insurance is vital for any business, any entertainment. If you don't have insurance, you're in trouble. But for anyone looking to start wrestling shows or any other form of entertainment, John has a very interesting story.
Yeah, when you're sort of starting any type of business, insurance, but like your house insurance, car insurance, you have to have it. So when I was starting out and wanted to do wrestling shows, the insurance was horrendous, in terms of the cost for me to do it on my own. So what we would have done is, when I was starting out, if I was hiring in a ring or, using another promoter to help me, I would have piggybacked off their insurance. And I have a story where at one of our big venues, we had an incident where there was a young child got injured. To this day, I'm still of the opinion it was nothing to do with the show, our wrestling show. They were just in the venue. They were in a hallway of the venue, and the staff had done some cleaning, obviously, and the floor was wet. The child fell. But when they went home and talked to mother and father and they put an insurance claim in, it was sent to me, being the promoter. And it just, it was probably a crazy moment too, where it just snowballed, where the venue was denying all liability. It was nothing to do with them. The young fella tripped and fell and hurt his foot. But that night the wrestling show was on, so it was the wrestling show's fault, nothing to do with us. But we got caught up in it, and it was just a whole bit of, toing and froing with the promoter who I'd used for their insurance, trying to get that resolved.
But you also had to bring in your own solicitor, which you had to pay.
Yeah, I ended up, it got to the stage where, the promoter I was using, and we were obviously using their insurance, was basically not answering our phone calls or faxes. So that's how long ago it was. Faxes and letters and stuff like that there. So eventually I engaged my own solicitor. We got a solicitor involved, which obviously cost money. And eventually it got as far as the actual court. But because the promoter didn't play ball with providing information, it was quite messy. But when it got to court, finally, the other party, which was a leisure centre, said, well, we'll accept responsibility for this. It was our fault. It was their wet floor. But we still had solicitors. I still had solicitors' bill to pay because I'd engaged a solicitor. But thankfully, it resolved itself. But it could have been a lot easier if the promoter had helped and worked with around the whole insurance aspect.
So technically you could say wrestling promoters, and not only wrestling, entertainment promoters in general have a bad reputation of being cagey, so yeah, that's a prime example.
There is some examples, yeah, I probably could tell you a few more, but it just was about, we work, you try and work with people, and if it works well, it works well. If it doesn't work well, you just then move on and go somewhere else.
I know now with insurance, particularly with GAA halls, if you're booking them, and it depends on your insurance provider, they have to get a special liability cover for GAA venues. And that means if there is someone's dog running across the background there, even though we didn't buy a ticket, you were shouting in their car park, and that dog gets run over, they hold you legally responsible. Yeah. Hence, you don't see many wrestling shows in GAA halls in Ireland anymore.
Yeah, it's insurance. I always know from insurance, even just, house insurance, car insurance, life insurance or whatever, it is a very difficult job to get through all the paperwork and the fine print. And that was one of the things you had to make sure that you had that cover for insurance for the eventuality if somebody got injured at your event. But you're quite right, there's some venues, like the one we had where the person got injured outside of our event, but yet they were trying to put the blame because we were on that night. So it must have happened at your show, so we're not paying out. So there was all this to and froing. But I say you learn. So you always try to look at that the next time and say, okay, what do we need to make sure we have in place next time to make it right?
So I think that's a very interesting story, because there is a lot of, these days in recent years, I've seen a lot of people get into promoting shows, regardless if it's Ireland, England, Canada, and they can barely afford to put the show on itself. So if you had got a problem like that, having to pay for solicitors or lawyers, as they're called in North America, it's very costly, and you need to be prepared for everything. And I find a lot of independent promoters on a minor level sometimes can't even pay the talent. Yeah. So isn't it very important to have the budget there? Because back in the day it was cash, you had to pay these guys cash in the night. Whereas now you can use PayPal and such other formats. But you need to have that budget. Yeah, to put your show on.
It's when I was sort of I would probably tend to be very good with finance. So when I was putting together my shows, I always made sure the budget was always well looked into. But you also looked at what the profit margin was to make sure. But you also, I would have always built in contingency, because you never know what's going to happen. So there would always be a contingency. And then, for example, I had to use some of the contingency to pay the solicitor's fees. So that was fine. That was less profit from the show, but at least it was built into the contingency. But yeah, you're quite right. I've seen other people where they're just literally working pound for pound or euro for euro. And you get to the stage where, if something at the last minute hits them, they've made a loss rather than a profit. And so you've put all the effort in, and you've got nothing back from it. I would have always worked on the basis, make sure you pin everything down. You're quite right, a lot of it was on a cash basis, so you were taking money from your income coming in and paying people, particularly the wrestlers on the night. I have a funny story, and this would only probably happen in Northern Ireland in terms of paying, is that I had just done a wrestling show in Downpatrick one evening. This is quite a few years ago, probably still during part of the troubles, so to speak, in the 90s. But I just done a show in Downpatrick, and I had to, I think it might have been one of the wrestlers was staying over in Newcastle, and so I had to drive over to Newcastle and drop him off. And on my way back, I was stopped by the police, because in those days we would have had a lot of police and army checkpoints. So I was stopped this evening by the police and the army. But the takings from the wrestling show had been put into my briefcase, and the briefcase had been put in the back of my car, for security, and the briefcase was locked. So of course I was stopped, and I was much younger then, so obviously I was a young fella, so of course there was loads of questions by the police. Where are you coming from? What are you doing? Just been promoting a show in the leisure centre, blah blah blah. Can you open the boot of your car? Open the boot of a car. What's in the briefcase? And your mind's starting to think, like, I'm going to be accused of being a drug dealer here. What's going to be this? But I knew there was quite a substantial amount of money in the briefcase from the show, and it was all cash, and I sort of was carrying it to bank on Monday. I think it was a Friday night, so I was okay. I opened the briefcase, and as I opened the briefcase, it was like you would have thought a gust of wind had just hit, and the money blew everywhere in the boot of the car. So trying to explain that to the police was quite difficult. Thankfully, I think in the briefcase I had one of the little flyers from the show, and I was able to prove it. So I had that incident where I thought I'm going to be caught here possibly for money laundering or drug dealing or something like that. There,
being paid off for a bag of guns.
Yeah, or for whatever, simply because I'd done a wrestling show in the leisure centre. And then there's a little bit of extra to the story in the sense that I sometimes play tennis. So I actually had a canister of tennis balls in the back of the car, and of course that looked a bit suspicious because it was a metal tin. So I have a funny story where when on reflection, I think the policeman asked me to open and take out the tennis balls and squeeze the balls to make sure there weren't any bombs or anything.
I've never heard that one before.
Yeah, so funny stories like that you sort of gather up, over the years of doing shows, which are our memories, which is obviously what it's all about.
stressful problems at the time, but in hindsight,
Yeah.
it's
When I tell
funny stories.
when I tell friends or people I know that happened, they just laugh, because back then that would have been, quite rare, or not rare, but quite frequent that you would get stopped and checked by a police or army checkpoint.
I always thought it was interesting because obviously sterling up here and euros. Well, it was pounds, Irish pounds, but when I met you, it was euros, became euros. But it goes up and down. So £1 sterling could be worth maybe 80 cent, or €1 could be worth 12. It always went up and down the value of the currency. But I used Matt Striker, who went on. There was two Matt Strikers, but this particular Matt Striker was the commentator with the WWE and a wrestler for a number of years. And you had agreed a price with him in sterling, and I brought him down to work a couple of shows with me.
That's right, yes.
And I agreed a price with him, but I gave him the euro value of what it was. It's the same money, but just in different currency. And I'll never forget paying him. It was just the two of us. Like, I always try and pay the celebrity wrestlers in private. Like, and this guy grabbed me, Matt Striker, as I was walking around. He said, hey, thinking I stiffed him. I was paying him less. And I remember calling you, and you had to explain to him the difference with the currencies, and it was in fact the same money. But it's interesting, the same country realistically, but just with different governments in each area, different currencies. Little things like that actually create problems.
I also have a similar story where, because obviously, as you said earlier, you used to pay people in cash. So I had an American wrestler, or a few American wrestlers on over one of the shows, and I had said, look, I'm going to pay you in sterling, and you can convert it, into dollars, because I'm not don't have time to go to the bank to get the dollars. But after the first show, paid them in sterling. Done a sort of, obviously there was no Google in those days, so you had to actually, check with the bank what the current rate is, so worked it out. But I remember then, like yourself with Matt, the guy comes up to me for the next show, and he grabs me and he says, "You're diddling me out of like $30 or something like that." And I said, "Oh, sorry, what do you actually mean?" And he said, I only got $200 from that when I should have got whatever, I said, "Look, I'm sorry, but I had calculated it, and I thought that it's okay. But don't worry, I will make up the difference. It's not a problem. I'll do the same today." But this went on all week. But, what happens is the currency exchange rate goes up and down. So by the time I had paid him in sterling and he went to the bank the next day, there could have been a difference of about $5 or $6. So I was constantly, but the reason the first one was wrong was because, and obviously I hadn't known this at the time, and again you learn, is that if you sell or buy dollars or sterling, there's different rates. So if you go in to exchange it in the bank from one currency to the other, they have a rate. But if you're doing it in reverse, it's a different rate. So, but every time we did this, there was like a 5% difference. So eventually I thought, I will get the dollars myself every day in the bank and come and give them to you, So after the first day, he was fine. We got it worked out. But again, I had that grab. You're trying to diddle me.
I had that one time with Vampiro. He's a Canadian wrestler, but I'd always pay lads in dollars when they come in, either dollars in cash or bank draft. So with myself, when he came in, it was obviously Rush. I know he had done some shows in England before he came over, and I think he wrestled for me several times in and out of the country. But this one particular time, he was a bit rushed, and he had a production crew with him. He was putting a show together for a movie he was making at the time. But I paid him in euros, and I always remember he sent me an email. And in fairness, when he was here, he was very professional, very helpful. But he just told me kind of how he was disappointed that he lost like $40-50, and he felt that I shortchanged him. But I just never thought of putting extra in it to make for the bank charge. So
So it's wee things like that, lessons that you sort of learn, as you go along. And obviously most of the people we were using were local people, or from England, or from in the south. So it was always, the currency was fine, But it was just that one time, and it was probably somebody, who, probably some people would say could be difficult, so you always got it on the wrong one. Some other people would have, said, oh, by the way, John, you didn't give me £10 there or whatever, oh, sorry, apologies, end of story. But others would have made a big deal about it.
John, we met in 2002. So before I get into our relationship from a wrestling point of view, can you recall any of the American wrestlers that you began to use prior to 2002?
Prior to 2002, I did some work with an American wrestler called Jake the Ripper Damien. I got him put in contact with me through another wrestling contact. Made a few phone calls to him. He sent over a few promotional videos because he wanted to do some shows over here. Brought him over, do a couple of shows. I used him actually because again back to the PR. I thought it'd be good marketing, So I used him probably as one of the most successful tours I had. He was literally on every news program.
And when was this, around 2001?
This was about 2001, I think that was that tour.
And prior to that was all wrestlers from England, was it?
Mostly from England, with the odd person maybe, if there was an American over in England or something like that, it might have been. But this was the first time. So he came over, we had an 8-day tour, I think, at that time. And literally, probably I would say it was the most successful tour around that time. But he then went over to England, did some shows over there. And then I have an interesting story which followed on from that, because we thought, he had huge potential to go further. So he went back to America. I was trying to think earlier on how I came about, but eventually I started talking to a guy called Kevin Sullivan, who'd just been working with WCW before it closed.
He was one of the top guys in, well, obviously wrestling for years, but within WCW, behind the scenes.
He was, I think before they finished, he was one of their top talent guys. He would have gone
talent relations
and got talent. But I got talking to him. He at that point advised me that he had been started working with a new promotion that had been set up in America called XWF. They were based in Florida. And he said, sure, why don't you come over and chat to us and stuff like that there. So, of course, I was going over to America. I think I was going for a wedding, actually, of a friend. So, took a couple of days and went down.
Just before you go on, John, so your initial contact meeting with, because this is before really your social media, where it was very easy to contact people in any business at all. But you obviously had a lot of contacts through your PR company, which was Get Plug PR at the time.
Yes, I had my PR company at the time, and I would have had a lot of contacts. I mentioned earlier about doing the WCW when they came to Belfast. That was through a company in London that I had contact with. So I would have had a lot of contacts, and I think probably from, I can't remember the exact contact, but probably from one of the contacts when I did that sort of interim work with the WCW, the name obviously was back, in America. So I got this contact. We then eventually got in contact with Kevin Sullivan, and off we went exploring to see what we could do. So I went to America for a couple of days. It was quite interesting. I had planned obviously just to go down, meet him for maybe an hour and head back up to New York. Ended up spending the entire day, had a great day with him. We went to his house. Jake came, that I was mentioning earlier, came from Las Vegas, and Kevin was booking him on to the shows that they were going to have, which was obviously good to help raise that profile for him. And then my involvement was potentially to see, and the dog's still going mad, isn't it? Just typical, So apologies if you're still hearing the dog. It's just, as you always, it's all quiet until you start talking. But anyway, they were interested in getting me maybe possibly to do some work with the plan to try and if I could sell the promotion to a TV network in the UK, and that again would have been through some of my contacts that I would have had. I would have made inquiries, but they filmed I think 4 shows, and then shortly after that it went belly up.
So if people want to look up XWF, just put it into a Google. But I do know, obviously there was a lot of money put into it. There was a legitimate businessman behind it. They ran some house shows that didn't really draw. That's probably some of the shows you're talking about. They didn't really draw well. They had some TV in Puerto Rico at the time. They ran a couple of shows there, but it didn't get off the ground. And there was a lot of talent behind it.
A lot of big names, as I say, you know.
Hulk Hogan was involved, wasn't he?
Yeah, Hulk Hogan apparently was behind it. They say the shows, they had quite a few big name stars on it. And from what I heard afterwards is the network just didn't want to buy, they didn't like what they were seeing in the initial shows. And I don't know whether there wasn't money to film more. I think that might have been.
So, needless to say, if I had worked out with the TV promotion, you could potentially be an original promoter here for them.
In Northern Ireland. You never know
yes.
Never know what was what it would have happened out of that, you know, because say the guy Jake I was working with at the time who had been on my shows, he actually participated in the shows. I think he filmed on 2 of them. So you never know what could have come from that.
Couple of stories there. I'll come back to one on Pat Barrett, but if the guy you're talking about, Jake, I know there was a lad from Las Vegas called Shooting Star.
Yes,
that name. I'm not sure if it's Jake. He worked for Scott Conway, Brian Dixon, a few other promoters, and that would have been around 2001, 2002. And I'll always remember I had a English guy from Liverpool called Frank Casey. His nickname was the Midge. He was referee on some of my shows, built my first ring, and he was a ring van guy for the first shows you did as part of our relationship. But when Frank was with me, he decided to rib this guy. It's the same fella, Shooting Star. And he rang up, apparently this is a joke that I used to do all the time over in England, but he rang him up pretending to be Bushwhacker Luke. Now, Bushwhacker Luke at the time was the booker in Puerto Rico.
Right.
So he rang him up and he was pretending to be Bushwhacker Luke, offering him like so many months' work, offering crazy good money. And I felt bad. The guy was getting all excited. So you can use this reference, that reference. I'm hoping to make myself. And I was just motioning Frank to stop. This guy get his hopes up. He was coming to Puerto Rico for 3 months. But I always remember that. It was actually hilarious. The guy was getting so into it. I know Pat Barrett. I won't go on too much about Pat. He's a story in himself. Quite a successful wrestler from Dublin, but I remember talking to Pat and he was very fond of Kevin Sullivan. They worked a lot together in the old WWF and they did a bit down in Florida together. So yeah, like Kevin Sullivan is a veteran as such, so it's just a shame that didn't work out from that point of view for you, because it could have been a foot in the door if XWF had took off.
Yeah, because at that time, as I say, you know, WCW had just been axed and from the American networks, and I think the American networks were looking something else. And as I say, it was just from the feedback I got, the networks they were talking to didn't like what they seen in the first shows that were filmed, and therefore it didn't progress any further. And I'm sure probably like television companies over here, American television companies are quite ruthless, you know, so if I've heard of even drama shows being filmed as a pilot and scrapped and not ever shown. In fact, I've even heard of even entire series, you know, of show being not shown simply because the network didn't like it or it didn't fit to their schedule. So it was disappointing, but you know, it didn't deter me from carrying on and doing some work in the business, and I carried on after that.
A story for myself is dealing with Americans back in the day. I remember Vampiro trying to get me to book the Irish leg of Wrestling Society X.
Right.
And then he changed his mind a year or two later. He wanted me to be the Irish promoter for AAA in Mexico, bringing shows in. So all these guys would want to get on to you. I remember another time there was NWA. We're looking at doing shows. That was around 2002, 2001. They wanted an Irish promoter. There was Extreme Hardcore, which was like an ECW reunion.
Yes, that's right, yes.
But you would have to pay these a substantial amount of money. And then they say, oh, well, you can keep the door. And then you'd have to fly the talent in, put them up, advertise the show. So a huge amount of money. But they're guaranteed a percent or that money. And if they'd want a venue that was a certain capacity and they want a percentage after a certain number. So arguments like after 2,000 people, they would want X amount of percentage of each ticket on top of the fee you're paying them, on top of all your costs. But no, I never went for that. It's just crazy.
It's, you know, it's like anything. It's back to what is the, you know, the business aspect of it. You know, when you look at a model like that's guaranteed probably a profit for them, but if it's untouched or never been done before, the risk all passes to you. And that's probably, when I started out and I did some shows with Orig, probably in a way it's like me putting my toe in the water by piggybacking off somebody else. But by doing that, I sort of had a good idea there was money to be made. But if you're going to have all the risk on your shoulders, then it doesn't become as more appealing for you to do. And when I started doing the shows on my own, yes, the whole risk was on my own shoulders, but I knew what I was doing. Where if I was probably bringing something like those types of shows in, I probably wouldn't know whether they would go down well or not. They have a market, but would that be the local market for us?
I remember for me, for the last 4 or 5 years of Irish Whip, it was almost sold on shows exclusively. And you get a certain budget and you work around that budget. But once it's guaranteed money, it's great. Like,
yeah,
it really is if you're selling the show on. But if you're buying the show and you're losing money. So I always never charge anybody too much and try to work with them.
Yeah.
As opposed, I've seen a lot of promoters do that in Europe. Let's say in the States, they charge a ridiculous amount of money and all these perks. But most times it's only once off tour. No one's going to bring you back in again. So if anyone looking to sell shows on, know exactly what you're providing to people, and that they'll get return business, which means you'll get return business.
Yeah, and it's probably it's like any business we do, it's all about that repeat business. So when I would have done shows, and I knew that, and you sort of get a feel on the night whether the show was good or not. You normally, I always would have done a lot of hanging around the exit where people are leaving just to hear the little buzzing that you got from people. You always got a good vibe, and that meant that you knew then you'd be able to go back there. You could take that risk to go back. But there was times you also maybe went to a venue and you sort of thought, no, that just didn't work, and I don't know whether I'll go back there or not. You have to make that judgment call in terms of will it work or will it not. And your repeat business is, like if you were to do shows on a regular basis in a town and you're doing a really good show all the time, you're going to get that repeat business and going to get people coming back.
But then you're also reliant on having a good crew.
Yeah.
And if a wrestler or wrestlers aren't happy with you, they'll make sure you have a bad show.
Yeah.
They're not coming back.
It's probably when I was always doing shows, I always sort of tried and went out of my way to make sure everybody was happy. Everybody knew what was their role and keep them happy, because that way then they will go out of their way to put on a good show.
And what's interesting is you're talking about earlier on before we started recording, Drew McDonald, a very well-known Scottish wrestler all over the world. He wrestled a bit in Stampede in Canada. He was your foreman, I suppose you would say, for one of your tours, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. On one of my tours, he was one of the key figures. Got him to come over. Great experience, great knowledge of the sport. Again, learnt quite a bit from him. And he was an instrumental part of one of my tours. But it was quite funny. I have actually a funny story about him as well, in that one of my very good friends would have been helping out on the show, and again trying to keep people happy, or if they wanted anything, he would have been doing like a runner behind the scenes. And I remember him saying to me that there was one night on one of the shows, they were all backstage. I don't even think the show had started, so he was doing a lot of, do you want water, do you want this, do you want that? And some of the wrestlers were going, oh yeah, I'll have a bottle of water, being, very fit and healthy. And I remember him telling me the story that when he went to Drew and said, Drew, would you like anything? And he turned around and said to my friend, I'll be having none of that water. I'll have my bottle of Coke and a Mars bar. And a real character, and, somebody who, from having all that knowledge and experience in the sport, was always wanting to help you. Always wanting, and the time he did the tour for me, he was always, giving me little bits of information and advice.
Do you know what I thought was interesting? You were talking about him earlier on, Orig Williams. So he started to do tribute shows.
Yeah.
Where he'd dress a guy up as Hulk Hogan, dress him up as Jeff Hardy. And it was quite interesting because obviously business had gone down at that stage for British wrestling. So by pretending to be the Americans who weren't really touring, I know they weren't touring Ireland at the time, he did huge business. But I remember seeing a show. He did a show in Dublin, the National Stadium, and he had some tremendous wrestlers on it, British wrestlers. And Drew McDonald was on it, and I can't remember. I think the Headbanger, one of the Headbangers.
Oh yes, yeah.
The wrestlers ones then. But I remember thinking that man is tremendous. Like, and he's out here dressed up as someone else. Now that's not a slight on the tribute shows, because if I could do that now and get away with it, I'd do it myself. So back then at the time, you're like, oh, that's blasphemous. But looking back, it was good business, like, you know.
Yeah, well, there, as you say, there was a period where there was a phase where it sort of had, and I think it was shortly around the time actually that British wrestling had come off the television. So there was a real lull, and it sort of went into, you know, the actual. And initially, there was a bit of decline. You know, sorry, tell a lie. Actually, initially when it stopped on television, there was a huge surge of people going to local shows because they couldn't see it on TV anymore. So there was, for a year or two after the TV ended, everybody was on a high because it was doing well, and then it just hit the floor. And I remember talking to one of the English promoters and said, "Well, look, what do you think happened?" And said, "Well, people just got fed up, you know, with what they were seeing, and it wasn't on television, so it was high for a while and then collapsed." You know, I am aware of, you know, a few threatening letters, legal letters that have been sent to people, you know, about don't be, you know, stealing our characters and don't be using marketing, which is obviously understandable. But obviously people get into that market for a while. And it actually did quite well for a period of time, you know. I remember being in England a couple of times after it started, and went along to, you know, one or two of the shows just out of curiosity, and they were packed to the rafters, you know, because really, you know, when you think about it, when, you know, people go to the show, and particularly that they were after the kids market then, you know, so to say that you have the Undertaker, you know, well, nobody knew whether it was the real one or not. So, and it was family entertainment.
Well, people, like, it used to be, I'm sure somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but initially it was the real wrestlers who were in the pictures, and then they changed it where somebody was dressed up. But for me, my background in entertainment was working in pubs and bars, and having bands coming in and what sold tickets. And I saw these tribute shows, and I was like, Jesus, money to be made here. And that's how I initially started. And I thought, like, if people see the real Americans, obviously not the guys who are under contract, they will come out and flock to see them, which made sense in theory, but in practice it was completely different.
And then gradually what you found too after that is gradually over the years, they when some of those stars had actually left WWE, or I think it was WWF at the time, when they had left, they started touring then, you know, so they came over to England, so they were actually having the real, you know, obviously maybe not the real Undertaker, but they were having some of those American stars who had been on television. So they then sort of started to move away a wee bit from the tribute ones, you know, although now and again I still see the odd poster.
Isn't it interesting? So for yourself promoting here in Northern Ireland, from 1995 to 2001, so you run these shows and you have English wrestlers and the odd time a Yank or American.
Yes.
So a decade prior to that, say the mid-80s or 70s, 60s, there was a wealth of Northern Irish wrestlers. Now, they weren't at the Americanised, it was very much the old amateur style. And they were just gone. Retired, left the business, and running shows here, and you can't get any wrestlers in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, when you look at sort of the, you know, the wrestling schools that were here, you probably...
But at that time there was none though, there was actually no wrestling schools in Ireland at that time.
But if you think of the history, you know, where there would have been and I talk about Carrickfergus because I believe that was one of the strongest ones. But when you think about that there was nobody, you know, that you can pull upon to help you with shows. You got one or two, you know. I can remember another young guy, you know, from the same area around Finlay came from, was Tony Stewart, another Irish young guy, and I had him on some of my shows once, and he was actually on television quite a few times, you know. But beyond that, you know, you couldn't say, oh yeah, there was 25 people that I could try and book for my shows. You know.
Last I heard of him, come back a good few years ago, he settled in for Manot, I think.
Right.
Enniskillen, maybe. But So let's just very briefly talk about Finlay. So everybody knows Dave Fit Finlay. And they're in Northern Ireland, this and that. What I think is a little bit sad is that his father, nobody really, people in wrestling would know who he is, but the general fan base wouldn't. And if they do know him, they know him as Fit Finlay's father.
Yeah.
But he was his own man, his own wrestler.
That's right, because obviously that's how Fit Finlay got into the business. His father was very successful and then obviously attracted his son into the business. And you're quite right, because then Fit Finlay became quite famous, obviously moved to America. The father was sort of forgotten about, but every now and again, I see in some newspapers when they, do stories going back in the past, you see sometimes some references to him,
And it's interesting because at the time, I know in England, they would copy off American names. And you had the Casey brothers down in County Kerry, who were big stars in America. And one of them settled over in England, and he had a nightclub in, I think it was the London area, I might be wrong there. But we were talking about Old Angus earlier on. Then he came up, his son started to wrestle under the name Steve Casey. So there ended up being like 3 Steve Caseys, and the original Steve Casey was actually from Kerry. He was the best Steve Casey wrestler.
Obviously. Not that you're biased in any way.
But Wild Angus himself, like I was saying, he trained people, I believe, but he ended up living over in Scotland. So you didn't have that, you didn't have those people to train them in. Dave Finlay Sr., I'm not sure, obviously I assume he just got sick of it like I did, you did, at the end of the day when he stops making money. But it's quite interesting that you have that wealth of wrestlers there back in the day. Then there's a big gap. And that happened across Europe. Spain used to be huge for wrestling. France, Italy, Romania, Russia. And that all died off as well. Like, they used to attract crowds of 30, 40,000 to some shows to where there was nothing.
Yeah.
Where did all those veterans go?
I suppose it's as you say, all those countries were very rich with talent and stars and, putting on shows all the time. And, you sort of look back at what's happening now, and it's never really reached the heights of what it was back then. And you do try to sit down sometimes and think, what happened? Why? But I think it's probably just changing times. People have other interests.
But if you think the 80s in Northern Ireland that happened, and then you come along in the 90s, nobody remembered John Noble, but I remember John Noble as the first modern day promoter up here in Northern Ireland. And you were your first guy in Northern Ireland to start using Americans, and you used Christopher Daniels, I think, just after
I did,
his
yes.
contract.
I used Christopher Daniels. I brought a few Americans over, used them on my shows, obviously give them a bit of profile. They obviously had profile. I always tried to get a few of the Americans that had a bit of profile themselves, whether it be not in WWE or WWF as it was then, but maybe on the indie circuit, But it was also, because it was around the time we were getting all these tribute shows, and I did feel, people are being really hard done by here. They're being told this is all these American stars. So I wanted to add real Americans into it so people could come to my shows and say, well, actually there was real Americans, It wasn't The Undertaker with an Irish accent, We didn't know The Undertaker was Irish, So I sort of, that was my drive to try and move into bringing some Americans over. Again, very expensive to do that because it wasn't in the days of Ryanair where you got cheap flights. So flights were quite expensive. So you had to make sure that what I was doing was right and was going to work well for me. And I have to admit, every American that I brought over did help me actually sell very good shows, and they put on fantastic shows for me. So it was worth it. But not everybody could do that. Not everybody could take the risk.
For me, just from my own history, when I started to run in 2002, and I used a few ex-WWE, WWF names, I used to have to advertise them as the real Tatanka, the real Jake the Snake Roberts, and people were like, well, who else is there? You know what I mean? But then the tributes had gotten people used to like
Yeah.
the real Americans
Yeah,
aren't Americans alike.
You know, it's like anything. You know, you would go along to something. You know, like for example, if you go along to a tribute band and close your eyes and you hear the music, you probably think, "Oh, that's the real band." And then when you open your eyes, you realise that's not. And probably, you know, at that time the market was very much for family-oriented young people.
Yeah.
And the young ones were going in their droves, and you know, they probably, you know, they just saw it was the Undertaker. They didn't know whether it was the real one or the right one. Maybe they didn't want to care, but you would have got that sort of feeling that sometimes, you know, it's just they're doing the Undertaker style stuff and that's it, you know.
I remember seeing, I can't think of the chap's name, was it Rick maybe? English guy, and he was on one of Orig shows and he was dressed, he did the Undertaker and he did Kane. I think it was because he had the long hair. But beyond the costume, looked nothing like.
Yeah.
And I remember all the disappointed kids. And what was interesting with those stadium shows, I remember going to see one around 1992, and it was packed. You had David Finlay, you had Franz Schumann, an Austrian wrestler, an old Irish wrestler from Monaghan called, I don't mean old, but old now, like, Rasputin. Johnny Howard, I think his name was. You had the Equalizer, who was Kevin Sullivan's tag team partner in WCW a few years later. Joint Haystacks was loaded with I remember being so excited seeing them, and there was only about 300 people.
Yeah,
it's like a 2,000 seat stadium, and there was only about 300 people. And flash forward 7 years, 8 years, tribute shows sold out for technically some of the same wrestlers dressed up.
Dressed up, different costume, but same person. It's also the same. I remember going to the Ulster Hall in Belfast. Used to be a very big venue for the big wrestling shows. Lovely venue as well. So that's obviously was part of the appeal. But I remember going there one night. Actually, we were going up into Belfast for something. And I saw there was a show, and we said, "Oh, let's go for it just to see." It was one of Orig's shows. He was promoting the show, and he had there was Finlay was on the show. Steve Regal was on the show. He had Danny Boy Collins, and I think he had a guy, Gary Walsh. All sort of reasonably big names in the UK at that point. And again, there would have been, the Ulster Hall holds about 1,500 people. They would have been lucky if there was 200, you know. And it was unfortunate because, like the type of venue it is, when you book a seat, you get an allocated seat number. So the 200 people were scattered all over this venue, where if it would have been me, I would have brought them all around the ringside, you know, and you would have thought the place looked packed. But I was quite disappointed. But top talent, you know.
That's not a slight. Sure, it's not a slight on those wrestlers or the promoter. It was the times. It had changed a lot.
Numbers were starting to dwindle. The the Ulster Hall is a big venue, you know. So you know, it probably they didn't know it wasn't, you know, going to be on a decline at that point. But yeah, numbers were starting to decline at that time. So you know, again, fantastic show. Couldn't fault the show. But just, you know, numbers were on the decline.
I can remember I had Frank Chic Cullen. Chic Cullen was his wrestling name in the world of sport, and he did a bit in all around the world, but he was known in Stampede wrestling as well. But I brought him in at one stage. He was actually living in Ireland, and I was handed out flyers one day for the show, and apparently his daughter had picked up one of the flyers.
Right.
And went back and gave it to him. So I ended up using him as a referee initially in some shows, but none of the lads, the Irish guys, you know, to a degree, some of the English guys who were coming up, like, that I had on the shows, really took him in. Like a man with a wealth of knowledge.
Yeah.
He didn't stay long in Ireland. He went back, but I used him again a couple of years later as for a DVD I was doing, and we were trying to work a deal out for him to come in as a trainer. But he was very tough, very kind of old school, and there was nothing wrong with it at all. And he was getting them to do the cardio, getting them to actually do the moves properly, and then show them how to like bring it into a match. I just remember most of the guys just being pissed off.
Yeah.
Why do we have to have him here? Like it's like, so any sign of hard work, or have to put a graft in, they weren't interested.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
it's
sad, really.
It's a bit like I remember when I first sort of got involved. You know, I remember I was doing one of my shows. We were doing a feature, and it was for one of the I think it was the ITV news show here was doing a feature, and they were interviewing one of the wrestlers for me, and the guy who actually was being interviewed was a little bit cocky about it, oh sure, it's all just for show, it's all entertainment, blah blah blah, you're not really getting hurt, you're not really athletic and stuff like that there. And I remember watching the old incident about Jackie Fullerton on TV with giant haystacks, where he lifted him up and slammed him down, and this guy did the same sort of thing to this guy, this presenter, and this presenter was quite a big guy. I mean, he was quite heavy, and I remember talking to him afterwards and said, I think I'll take my words back. Because he was again of that mindset, oh, it's fake, you're not really getting hurt, you're not really doing anything, and this guy just lifts him up, puts him down, and the guy said, well, if you're doing that every night, I'm going to believe you, it's sore.
but that's it. That's what you were talking about in the start of the conversation. A lot of these guys were actual athletes, trained like amateur wrestlers, technically combat fighters, whereas now they're not. So you couldn't say to someone back then, you're fake, but it was not real. Yeah. Because a lot of these guys, there was a guy called Boston Blackie. Ever heard of Boston Blackie?
Yes, I remember Boston Blackie.
Very good wrestler, very tough guy if anyone you talk to. He used to do The Rock. He used to be fake tan and all that. But the guy was actually, from what I've been told, tough as nails, and he could hurt you quite easily. But guys like that are gone out of the wrestling business. Now it's kind of kids or people who think they're tough, and it's night and day. So you can understand now if somebody says, oh, that wrestling's fake. Yeah. But back then you couldn't say that to someone who was a genuine athlete or a fighter.
Yeah. No, I when I sort of started getting involved, you really were getting the very athletic American influence coming into the UK, and some of the UK stars started going in that direction. I mentioned earlier about Drew McDonald and his Coke and his Mars bar, but Coca-Cola, yeah, sorry, I should say. But he was very much making a wee bit of a fun of the other young guys who were on the show, because they were very athletic, and they were drinking water and stuff like that, and he was going in for his usual Coca-Cola and Mars bar, and that was sort of, you had to have that balance. There would have been people who would have been old school, who it wasn't about the athletic, it was about the talent, the skills. Then you got the young athletic ones coming in, and it was more about performance rather than actually the wrestling ability. I
said Northern Ireland is part of the UK officially through the government, and I know to bring in non-UK wrestlers, you're supposed to have a work permit, a permit for them to do shows. So in your experience back then, how did that work for you, bringing American guys, say, into Ireland, Northern
Ireland? Back then, actually, it was, I didn't really know how complicated it was going to be, or whether it was going to be simple. But when, I was sort of setting up, the tours, and I was organising who I was bringing in, then we would sort of look at what was required in terms of paperwork. I also had, we were talking about competition from promoters, where you were sort of getting veiled threats, where maybe somebody would make a phone call. But I sort of looked into what you needed to have to bring in an American, and it was a very simple application for a temporary work permit or visa, whatever it's called nowadays. And it was quite easy and very simple to get, simply because there is a category, and there still is today, but back then there was a category if you were bringing in a sports person, and you can justify the need to bring in that person. So when I was filling out the forms for it, you would always just, explained that, I was doing an American style wrestling show. I wanted to have some Americans, but the majority of people who would be working on the show would be local people. And it was very simple. It was very easily to get the work permits for them to come in, which meant then when they arrived into the country, then they were fine.
And what would a work permit cost you?
I think back then it was something like £15. It's probably hundreds and hundreds of pounds now. I'm again back to showing my age, but it was about £15 just to get a work permit, and it was for the length of time you wanted. So, for example, if you were running a tour for a week, you could get it for a week, but if you were doing something for a month, you just got it for the month, whatever time, as long as it was granted. And again, it was back in the days where you got it sent to you in the post. It didn't come by email or anything like that. But it was quite straightforward. I didn't think it would have been, because obviously I'm sure over years immigration and work permits and stuff like that are quite complex, and I know they have got more expensive, but it was quite simple to get them back then.
I know myself, obviously I promote shows throughout Republic of Ireland, and actually I've done every county in Ireland, Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland. But what I found interesting was, while the UK technically falls under British law, Northern Ireland was different to England. England was different to Scotland, Scotland different to Wales. So I never really needed the paperwork in England or in Scotland. Excuse me, I'll start again. When I ran Northern Ireland, I didn't need the kind of paperwork I later realised I needed in England. And I remember I had a show booked in Halifax over in England, near Manchester. And it was in an Irish club, and I'd sold maybe almost 300 tickets, and I was delighted. They were brilliant. And about 2-3 days before the show, I was asked for my permit to run the wrestling event. Now, I knew about bringing in wrestlers from abroad and working permits, but I didn't realise I needed a permit for that particular show with that council. And I went to get it. It was only £20, I think, at the time, but I needed 5 working days. And the end of the show was cancelled.
Oh.
And I was raging. But I had it happen to me in Bradford as well, running shows over there, and I found out who was ringing up the venues. And it was a very well-known, old school English promoter who him and his family would have run England for a long time. But he didn't like an Irish man coming in and running their territory, even though he had retired from the business back in the 90s, early 2000s. And I'd lost several shows over that little bit of paperwork.
Yeah.
And then when I did shows in Wales and Scotland, when I applied for those pieces of paper, I was told I didn't need them.
Yeah. Yes, it's quite interesting in all different parts of our life. We are, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales, England, Northern Ireland, but there is complete differences in each of those areas. So, obviously now it's probably you've got a devolved administration in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So sometimes they can set the rules, and other things they can't. So obviously the license in that case was probably the local authority license, which would be an English type of license. We don't have that here, so our laws would be slightly different. So it's the same too with things like gambling license or a liquor license. Depending where you are, you might need one.
Isn't it quite interesting though? I mean, because in Northern Ireland, a lot of the venues are council run.
Yeah. And
it's the same in England, Wales, and to a degree Scotland. But yet, technically, they're all the one council under the one law, but they all operate different to each other.
Well, you see, the laws are slightly different in each region because although they're deemed local councils, if you look at the local councils in England, they have a completely different portfolio of work that they're responsible for than in Northern Ireland. So it's down to the local laws. So you have local laws. So in England, a council would have greater powers and greater laws to do things. Where we here, we sometimes joke here that the councils here in Northern Ireland are only responsible for deaths and dog licenses. Not true, but that used to be a running joke. Where in England, they would be wider, and also you'd find with local councils, for example, if you were going to book a venue and it had a bar attached to it, you might have to have a special license to run, because you're going to have kids coming in to watch a wrestling show. So it can be a bit of a minefield. And sometimes it's good if you have, and obviously we all learn the lessons, but sometimes it's good, if you're actually going to do a show somewhere, is if you know somebody who lives in the area, just ask them, look, what sort of things should I do or look out for? Like if I was selecting venues, I would talk to maybe some people and say, well, where should I put the show on? What's the best place? Because you can pick a venue that is not the best. And
I actually stopped running shows. I only tried it over like a 8-month period, England, Scotland, and Wales, just because of the mess. And like you said there, if you know someone in the area,
yeah.
But sometimes these people in the area don't give you the information you need. It's almost as if they want to see it fail.
Yes.
And then next thing you know, they're working for some other promoter in the region 2 months later.
It's back to that rivalry and competition among promoters, which happens in every sport and everything you do in terms of promotion.
So technically, Irish Whip Wrestling ran not only in Ireland, Northern Ireland, but England, Scotland, Wales, but it was the disaster over the mainland Britain because of the peoples in different. But look, I learned from it and whatnot. John, this has been very interesting. It's been brilliant. We're going to stop now and we're going to have a part 2 because we have a lot more to talk about from Northern Irish wrestling and yourself point of view. So folks, join us for part 2, and for that little last part we spoke of, anybody doing entertainment, you have a history in PR as well, always check with your local councils within the UK.
That's it. Good advice.
Thanks very much, Sean.
Thank
See
you.
you in part 2.